Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the last session of today's event. The topic is Stepping Stones from Diversity Learning to Equitable Actions. Our speaker is Cindy Gross. Cindy is an ex-techie and MCM, in fact, who left a career at Microsoft to be a generative coach and adaptive community leader. She nurtures equitable anti-bullying, anti-racist cultures via coaching partnership with tech leaders. I have been personally been a mentee, or I've taken Cindy as my coach for some time, and I have really benefited and enjoyed the experience. So, recommend it to anyone who is looking for a coach in this direction. That's it. Take it away, Cindy.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your kind words. I have had quite a journey from the tech world into the coaching world. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, and how I think tech in particular, all business environments, but tech in particular can really benefit from a deeper change than most diversity programs currently are leading us to take. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I do want to go back to the introduction that Mala just gave us. So I do come from the tech world. I come from the world where everything is hyper rational, where we suppress our emotions, where we think that we live in a meritocracy and that everything is fair because we can measure it with math and with data. And that was an environment that in the end I decided wasn't working for me after 25 years in the industry. So I stepped out, took some time off, and decided to be a generative coach. And that's really about creating transformation by creating awareness and clarity within my clients. And that is combined with what I've learned in how to be an adaptive community leader. And all of that came together in Befriending Dragons, which is about taking something that's scary, your typical childhood image of a white knight on a white horse, and like white knight, literally a white man in shining armor on a white horse attacking the dragon and assuming that the dragon is the bad guy. And the dragon is something to be defeated by force of arms and just taking over. And instead thinking about, wait a minute, let's ask why the dragon's there. Let's ask what benefits the dragon can have, and what are some different ways to approach that might include befriending the dragon literally. It might mean all sorts of different ways of approaching things differently, walking around the dragon, simply taking a different route instead of facing things in a very confrontational way. So that's where the name Befriending Dragons comes from. And it's really about befriending our internal dragons, our fears and our concerns and our expectations, our perfectionism, all of those things. And that, I think, is an approach that tech can adopt more widely in order to disrupt the inequities we have in our systems. So most of us in life, we act first with the thought that we want to have specific things. And then we think in the end, someday when we retire, we'll get to be what we want to be. And so fundamental to coaching, fundamental to a different approach to the world that creates more equitable outcomes is to flip that around and think about who we want to be first, who we want to be as individuals and who we want to be as companies. And then we can take that, we can befriend our internal dragons in my terminology. And that's what enables us to nurture anti-bullying and anti-racist cultures. And we do that by speaking up and speaking out. We get to listen when other people speak up and speak out, and that lets us regain our voices. And that's also the foundation of uplifting marginalized voices. So other people who tend not to be heard, uplift their voices. So when you hear stories about asking men to say something when other men in the room interrupt the women in the room, for example, that's uplifting marginalized voices. Another thing we tend to do is those of us who aren't in the current power structure tend to be told over and over again to stay small. So instead, I want to say to be big, and then make yourself stay that big as you want to be in the world. And that also requires leading with empathy. So instead of locking up our emotions like tech tries to tell us to do, lead with our emotions, lead with empathy, and lead with social equity. And in the end, what we will have as an industry is a more innovative set of products that we're producing and a workplace that reflects the global population. And that's a virtuous cycle where the more the people that we work with reflect the people who are actually buying the products, the better the products become, the more we sell, the more successful the companies are. And that allows us to have the change and the impact we want to have in the world. So I'm going to do something that some of you may be familiar with, which is a land acknowledgement. And this is really about having cultural humility. So let me just step right into it. Thank you for taking part in today's land acknowledgement. I encourage those unfamiliar with the practice to learn more about why it is so important and incorporate it into your own communities. You can use a land map such as that at native-land.ca, which is on the slide on the left side, to find what land you occupy, and then visit those nation sites to get their thoughts on how they want land acknowledgements to be done. And that helps us all thrive together. I am Cindy Gross. I live in Issaquah, Washington, outside Seattle in the United States. I live on the stolen lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish. So that last sentence is an example of how you might introduce yourself in a community that does land acknowledgements. I still benefit from institutions, including governments and schools, built on land stolen from Indigenous people, built with the labor of Black people ripped from their own Indigenous homelands, and the descendant of colonizers and those they tried to destroy, the Lenape, now known as the Delaware, who greeted tired, starving travelers on America's East Coast and welcomed them to this continent. And our society still suffers from the suppression of those matrilineal cultures that so many Indigenous tribes in the Americas had. And we will grow and we will thrive when we reclaim more of those community-focused traits that we've coded as too feminine and therefore not valuable. I am descended from the Lenape peoples. I am a citizen of 2 Native nations. I know my legally defined blood quantum, but that doesn't tell me which parts of my DNA are typically found in any specific Native population. My citizenship also doesn't confer automatic cultural connections. I really don't have very many of those. It's pretty complex. When you talk about Indigenous people, there's citizenship, DNA, lineage, cultural connection. They're all distinct and they're often inappropriately mixed. Terms such as Native, Indigenous, Indian, First People, First Nations, they're all problematic in some way. If you're talking about someone, or if you know someone who identifies as Native, use their terminology for themselves and their communities, and whenever possible, use their specific Native affiliation. In other words, call me Delaware or Cherokee, which are my 2 nations. Don't call me Native American if you're referring to me. Remember that Native people are still here, still suffering from systemic oppression, and still loving, laughing, and thriving. Choose to honor them, don't appropriate from them. Live by the idea of inspired natives, not inspired by natives. In other words, buy from Native people who created things. Don't buy things that copy or appropriate from Native styles or Native people. So, thank you for pausing to see and listen to the Native folks around us. And that, folks, is an example of a land acknowledgement. And you're probably asking, what does that have to do with tech? What does it have to do with diversity and equity? Really, it is about understanding how the history of where we're at influences what we build into the future. And when we see the people around us, when we see the land around us, when we see the communities around us, and we expand our definition of who our community is, that's how we grow and thrive. And that's how we disrupt the inequities in the system. So land acknowledgements are a way of reconnecting with the people around us, reconnecting with the land that we live on, and nature, and communities, and breaking down individualism and hierarchies. So this is all about a commitment to be and do better. And I want to point out, because the rest of my talk will keep referring to this, that land acknowledgement is a way of breaking down white supremacy or racism. And racism is the systemic, unequal distribution of power and resources on the basis of race in order to uphold white supremacy. You can substitute this with other oppression dimensions. For example, sexism is a systemic, unequal distribution of power and resources on the basis of gender to uphold patriarchy. So when we disrupt systems, we are disrupting the unequal distribution of power and resources, and we're changing the way that we distribute them. And the land acknowledgement that I gave earlier is on my Medium blog, so you can find that there. There's also in the comments a link to a recording of me doing the talk for the CEO initiative. So now I want to talk about white male bars. And basically, these are the hiring and success bars that we have all around us that are shaped like the people in power now. And we usually don't see it because we're so used to seeing these bars. And we think of it as, here's a bar, like a bar you would jump over and doing hurdles and track, or a bar you'd go under in doing limbo. And really what we've got are these really convoluted shapes of the gates that we have that keep us in certain categories or that keep us from entering the room. And right now, the people that are in power, I'll say in North America, but in a large part across the globe, are white men. So these bars are shaped around those expectations. So for example, confidence. My last team at Microsoft, one of the main criteria that they explicitly said they were hiring for was confidence. They said, well, the recruiters have screened for their technical competence. So what we're looking for in the hours-long, grueling interview process in person is confidence. And what that fails to take into account is that confidence looks different on different people. So for example, the type of confidence that we're generally looking for is brash, verging on arrogant, or maybe going fully into arrogant. And those are the types of confidence markers that are tolerated and rewarded in white men. But when a woman shows those same traits, she's called bossy. And when a Black woman shows those same traits, she's called an angry Black woman. And when a Black man shows those traits, he's called all sorts of names. So really something as simple as hiring for confidence or looking for somebody who is confident is a white male bar. The same sort of discussion with passion. So many groups in tech hire for passion. I want to hire the people that are really passionate about this work, that are passionate about our product, that are passionate about our company. And you see that in the standard hiring questions that we ask people to prepare for, that people want to be asked, or that people tend to ask during interviews. Why did you choose our company? And the answer is expected to be something about how excited people are about that product. And what that does is it tilts it toward people who have the energy and the time and the freedom to go out and learn things in their spare time so that they know all sorts of little facts that they can throw out there. It tilts the hiring or the promotion process towards people who are showing enthusiasm in a certain way, because there's only certain emotions that we allow in the workplace, especially in tech. So passion tends to be, again, shaped like the people currently in power. Our definition of it, when we see it, when we recognize it, when we call it a good thing and not a bad thing, tends to be shaped in a way that works best for white men. And when people who aren't white men try to do exactly the same things, there's tons of studies out there that show the ways that those same approaches don't work for people who stray further from this ideal of the white male way of coming across. Same thing with work ethic. So when we think of a work ethic, we're talking about how many hours we put in, how hard we work, how we relate to people. And again, we think about when you want somebody who can work late or somebody who can work weekends, it's much more likely that a white man has the ability to work late and work weekends. So it seems like these are neutral terms. It seems like these are things that, well, who could argue with that? Why would you not want people to have these traits? It's great that we have these traits, but we need to realize that they show up differently and are rewarded differently in different people. And so it's seeing those white male bars and recognizing when they do fit that criteria, and then making adaptations to our systems, not just what I as an individual know, but what all the other systems and people around it know. So everybody else on the hiring team, the tools we use to give our hire, no hire recommendations, the tools we use to do performance reviews need to recognize that we need more ways of looking at the world. One thing I really love is Kim Creighton's approach to this. So she's a tech person who has the guiding principles you can see on the screen. And the one that I really want to highlight here is that when you're not being inclusive at work, it's a risk management issue. Companies are at risk in many ways when they aren't being inclusive, when they don't have goals of equity in hiring and product development. And that's an issue with losing people like me who reported harassment and had a downhill slide after reporting harassment. It wasn't the harassment itself that drove me out of tech. It was what happened after I reported it that drove me out. So that's a risk management issue. On average, in the tech world, according to the Kapoor Institute, and I remember talking to multiple HR people that this is pretty much true in a lot of companies across the United States, it costs an average of $120,000 to replace a tech employee. That's not just the cost, the literal cost of the recruiters and the people who fly out to recruiting sites or, all of that. It's the time when nobody's in the position. It's the bad press when somebody leaves. It's the time it takes to ramp up a new person. So when you have an environment that doesn't seem fair, that's not inclusive enough to all of your employees, what you end up with is costing your company a whole lot of money. And that's a risk issue. You also run the risk of being sued. I was involved in a couple of different attempted lawsuits when I was leaving. I did not sign them because they were signing the NDAs and the no rehire clauses would have been incredibly harmful to me personally, emotionally, to my mental health in ways I wasn't willing to compromise on. And the amount they offered was insultingly low from the harm compared to the harm that was done to me. And the companies still have to consider that a risk management issue because sometimes they pay out millions of dollars for these sorts of lawsuits. So everything about being equitable is risk management. And when you think of it that way and you think of that business case, there's a really good reason to focus on this. So before I get into what we do about this, I've laid out a bunch of problems. So now it's a time to take some questions and see what you guys are thinking right now.
Anyone have any questions? All right, nothing here now, Cindy.
No questions?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll keep going, and please start asking your questions. Put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll see what we can do. I'll keep going through this, and I'm more than happy to answer specific questions. So what I want to focus on is how we change the stories in our life. So what story do we tell now? What do you tell yourself? What stories is your company telling you? What stories are we telling each other? And really the keys to shifting that are thinking about who we center in these stories. Who is the protagonist? Who's the one we have sympathy for? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? That's about who's centered. Whose viewpoint are we using when we tell the stories? And quite often, remember those white male bars, we're telling things from the perspective of what's familiar. And what's familiar based on who gets referred to as an expert in news stories, who gets quoted as an expert in books, who gets published, who gets paid to write books, who is centered in all of these narratives of here's how I became successful, do what I did. They again tend to be much more often white men. And the things that white men do, again, are not necessarily accepted, let alone rewarded in people who aren't white men. So when we change the stories we're telling and we think about how does that look from the perspective of someone else? How would that look if a Black trans woman tried to do the same things that a white man is saying, here's how I became successful? So change the story and think about, well, what is going to make her be successful? What does she need? And that means you have to ask her. You can't assume, you can't look from the outside. You need to talk to the people most affected and listen to them. This is also about power dynamics. So anytime you're hearing a story, you need to question what power dynamics are in play. When you think about what's going on with Governor Cuomo right now, there's the literal, what happened? Did he approach women in his office? Did he show up and say things that were inappropriate at work? But there's a big difference between two people who just graduated from college and have been hired at the same time having those interactions, and the governor of an entire state who is on the news every day for a year, and somebody who's recently out of college and doesn't have a lot of experience. There's a whole lot of difference in the power dynamics at play in that situation. And it's important to look at that, recognize that, and see how those power dynamics play out in every interaction that we're talking about, whether it's the people we're working with, again, who gets hired, who gets promoted, how we respond when somebody talks about something that, I think somebody just did something that felt racist to me, or somebody just did something that felt sexist to me, or I was pushed out of that conversation because I have a hearing disability and nobody was willing to make accommodations for that. Whatever those things are, we really need to lean into questioning the power dynamics. Another thing that is a key question to ask is what other truths exist. Quite often people will say, well, we didn't hire her because, list of reasons. Always ask, and what else? Because race and gender always are involved in some way. It's never is this power differential different because of race or gender. It's how is it different? It's never if, it's how. Race and gender always play into how we're taught to react to how people say things and how they act. So there's always additional truths, and you can always go multiple levels deeper. Many people, especially those of you who may do consulting, are familiar with the 5 whys. Somebody says why, you ask them, well, why did you say that? And you go at least 5 layers deep. Use that same technique when you ask, well, why did we choose this person to be hired over that person? Why did we choose that person to be promoted over this other person? That's great that you promoted this person because they have been very active with this other team. What about this other person? Were they very active with that team, but they didn't talk about it? Because every time they talked about it, they were told that they were bragging or they were being bossy, or all of these terms that tend to be used to hold down people who aren't white men. So there's always additional truths to be found. There's also the reframing, because it's not just that there are additional layers, it's that sometimes the truth we just accept without question is just flat out wrong. And so we have to be willing to question those things and look deeper than we have before. And in the end, the whole point is to tell a different story. Instead of saying, we hired the objectively best person for the job, no question, and I can't help it if every single person on our team is a white man. That's just the way it turned out. Another story might be, we know that there is value in having a wide variety of lived experiences and a wide variety of working styles. And we value having a team that is not all representative of a single demographic. And because we value that, we're going to go look at our hiring criteria, because obviously there's something in that hiring criteria that is a white male bar that is keeping out people who aren't white men, because we can't see what those things are. For example, professional. This person was more professional. This person was more confident, passionate, had a better work ethic. All of those play into professional. You know what else plays into professional? The way people dress. So a woman who wears a dress never knows if she'll be considered professional or not in tech. A woman who wears a dress in some other professions might be preferred over somebody who doesn't wear a dress. But in tech, I've personally experienced the confusion when I walk into the room in something other than pants. So there are things that we're pretending don't matter, but they do. Another great example is hair. There is an assumption that the professional way to look is with straight hair or gently curled hair, and that the hair fits within a certain narrow dimension of acceptability. And that has been used for generations to keep Black people out of certain professions because they want to wear hair the way their hair naturally grows. So afros or locks, what some people call dreadlocks, those sorts of things have been used as an excuse to not hire people. And it's not just a choice of style. It is about history and heritage. And going back to the land acknowledgement that I did earlier, their connection to their communities, their connection to their roots and their cultures are tied to how they look and how they show up and how their traditions are and are not allowed in the workplace. There's also the fact that in trying to get Black people's hair to act like white people's hair acts, which is an unreasonable request to begin with, it can be expensive and dangerous. There are chemicals that are used and heated appliances, curling irons, straightening irons that are used on Black people's hair that can burn them, that can cause harm. And some people are fine with that trade-off, but some people are doing it only because workplaces, up at least until the last couple of years, haven't allowed them to have hair that they didn't spend all that time, money, and effort on. So tell a different story and say it's okay. No, it's not just okay. I love it when people show up authentically, and I have created an environment where people truly can show up authentically and be rewarded for it and valued for it and praised for it, not just merely tolerated, not an environment where you say, well, you're allowed in, but you're not acting quite right. You haven't assimilated enough. So tell a different story.
There are a few questions, Cindy, if you'd like to take them.
Okay, sure. Do you want to read one to me?
Sure. I would love your thoughts on job descriptions and how to make them attractive to diverse candidates. We've tried to avoid terms like rock star, etc., but I'm always looking for more ways to remove exclusionary terms. Are there any websites or resources for this?
Right. So job descriptions are interesting. First of all, I'm going to talk about how we focus too much on hiring, because what happens is we hire in people that are a little bit different than the people we've hired before, but we quite often do that without first making the environment safe for them and without changing the people and the processes that are going to make them assimilate into our current culture. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Personally, I love Katrina Kibben, Kibben, 3 Ears Media. And she is the master of writing job descriptions and on publishing really great information on how to make your job descriptions more accurate, and more accurate by its very nature makes them more inclusive. Because what's wrong with most job descriptions isn't that they use terms like rock star and things that tend to appeal to white men more than to other people. It's that those are actually not good descriptors. The impact, it's a white male bar, but it's also an inaccurate gate. It's an inaccurate proxy for what you're trying to get to. So I recommend following Katrina Kibben and Liz Ryan. And they have a ton of information on job descriptions and the interview hiring process that can really make you be more inclusive. And like most of the time when you're more inclusive and going for more equitable outcomes, you're actually improving everything about the process anyway, because your job description is now actually paying attention to what are the actual requirements. Do I really need someone with a 4-year degree? Or can I have someone who either has a 4-year degree in one of these, 5 different areas, and or who has these life experiences or experience with particular types of projects or particular types of technology? And instead of making that a requirement, can you make it a nice to have? Can you reframe your job description to say, I need for you to have a body of experience and a learning style that will let you, within the first 1 year on your job, ramp up to be able to do these things, instead of saying you must come in with these things, for example. So, I'm sure there's, hours and weeks worth of depth that you can go into there. And I'll get into a little bit later why it's really not the best place to start. So what's the next question?
What are your thoughts on statement from hiring managers and companies that the person is not a fit for the position, even though the person is highly skilled?
So the short answer to that is never, ever use culture fit. Always think about culture add. And that's easy to say, it's harder to do. So when you think about somebody not being a fit, we go back to the white male bar concept. It's that you're looking for somebody who makes you comfortable and somebody that easily fits through the gates that you have. And I'm using gates and bars pretty interchangeably here. So when we talk about gatekeeping, or when we talk about someone who is standing there saying, you can come in, you can't come in, that's what culture fit is. And these gates in tech, in most business environments, even female-dominated business environments, the gates are still shaped like white men. They have those expectations and those the goals in both who you hire and what the expectations of these people are once they're hired. So when you say culture fit, what you really mean is somebody who makes you comfortable or somebody who reminds you of somebody who's already in that position. So if you have an environment like so many tech environments where most of the people in the environment are white, or in a lot of companies, white, Chinese, or Indian, and you have somebody who doesn't fit in that category, then you're not as comfortable and you're looking for reasons to say, well, they're not a fit. And you're probably using these proxies like confidence, passion, work ethic. And there's, buckets full of these white male bars that we don't think of as being racist or sexist. But at their core, they are changing the distribution of power and resources. And underlying that is gender and race. And they're really deep and they're really hidden. And unless we look for them, we don't see them. Because they're around us, they're all around us, and we can't see them. And we can also point to, well, that woman made it through, or that Black man made it through the bar. But what we don't see is all the cuts all over them from having to fight their way through a bar that wasn't shaped for them, that wasn't made for them to go through. So if somebody says they weren't a fit, I would really question what you mean by that and quantify it. And use that method of the 5 whys. When you say they didn't qualify because they weren't technical enough, and we know that's a term used for people who aren't white men all the time. I was told I wasn't technical enough when I moved over to the Windows team. I talked to people from my old environment from SQL and big data, and I go, well, you're incredibly technical. But what they meant on my new team was I didn't know their technology in the same way and talk about it in the same way that they did. So they started telling me I wasn't a technical person and pushing me into more admin type activities. And it's not that an individual person in the room did it on purpose. They didn't hate me. They didn't offend me. They didn't intend any harm to me, but they created great harm by following the systems that were in place on that team. The systems they couldn't even see because they didn't look. So instead of asking about fit, ask about culture add. What does this person add? Not just from a technology perspective. Are they the first person on the team that doesn't know this particular coding technology and they know something else instead? That's great. Bring them on. If they are somebody who can ask questions about, well, wait a minute, what do you mean that algorithm is based on zip code? Because if you're saying that, and there's tons of examples of this, like credit scores, credit score algorithms are built on zip codes. Somebody who has lived in a zip code that is resulting in a lower credit score is probably not white. Great chance they're not white. And somebody who has lived in one of those zip codes is much more likely to be able to point out when the algorithm's being built, wait a minute, when you use zip code in this algorithm, you are introducing racial bias into the algorithm, even though you didn't write anything into your algorithm that said it was based on race. And I do want to call out weapons of math destruction, MATH. There's a great TED Talk. There's a book, Weapons of Math Destruction. There's a book called Technically Wrong. And there's a newer book, I think it's Algorithms of Color, that talk about how we encode our biases into all these AI ML algorithms that we're creating right now. So did I answer that question?
Like you did. So there is another one.
Okay.
How do you discuss those issues? I presume by those, this person means issues around diversity or racism or something similar. How do you discuss those issues with potential employers? If you left your previous employment because the environment didn't nurture diversity, it seems totally disingenuous to alter the truth, but a bit dangerous to be too honest.
Yes, that is an excellent question and hard to answer. So I ran into that when I reported harassment, because I started thinking about what happens when I apply for the next job. So it's very similar to that question, where if I say I left because I was harassed and nobody supported me when I reported it. The person who I reported for harassment was sent to coaching. He was sent to some amount of training, and then he was put in charge of training for the team as a way to teach him to relate to the rest of us better, right? So that was not something I felt I could talk about in an interview at my next job. Why did you leave? I was going to have to use the other truths that were also there. So the other things that were true in that situation are the team I'd learned everything I needed to learn on that team, and I'm ready for a new experience. I'm ready for a new way of looking at things because I'm looking to grow in a new direction. That's also true, and I can talk about that. So you can find those additional truths. It is, however, very damaging from an emotional perspective, a mental perspective, to have to make those calculations and try to figure out how much you can say at the next job. So that was part of it. And the other half was, how do you know that your new team is going to be safe? I would say, first of all, it's really hard to know for sure, but start asking questions about how many people like me, gender, race, age, disability, whatever it might be, are in a position of power in the organization, not new hires, not people that can't ever get promoted for list of reasons that technically pass a legal muster for being reasons not to get promoted, but how many people who are like me are actually in positions of power, who have a say in what's going on. So that's one question that you can ask directly or indirectly. You can ask other people at the organization. You could look at who's on their board of directors. You could look at their executive team. Another way to think about it is when you ask questions of the manager, and remember, in an interview, you're interviewing them. I, as the candidate, I'm there to find out if that company's a fit for me. So go in with that attitude to start with. And then think about asking, what do they admire most in their employees? The last person on that team who got promoted, what were they promoted for? And listen in a different way, using these question the narrative types of points. Like, what do they say in between the lines of what they're saying? When they say that they promoted somebody because they were a rock star, from that previous job description question. Rockstar is somebody who generally is taking credit from other people, who is taking advantage of the privileges they have in the environment. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go into that. If they start describing the last person on the team who got promoted in terms that are not comfortable to you, or that you found are impossible for other people to regularly apply to you, then that's probably not a good fit for you. If instead they answer, well, that person got promoted because they were really good about building relationships and they worked across multiple teams in a way that showed that they could get to the heart of a problem, for example. And if that happens to be your strength or your working style, and you can recognize that that is a relationship focus, team building focus, and that is something you want, then you can say, well, maybe this is a team I want to be on. So you can ask these indirect questions to try to determine if the new team is going to be a good fit for you. Any other questions?
No, we're good. You can proceed.
Okay. All right, great. So let's go on to the next slide here. So some of the news stories we can tell. And so when you're talking about people, and this goes back to that last question as well, when you focus on equity, you really are talking about, at this point in time, the companies that are going to survive and thrive are the ones that focus on equity. And I do want to take a step back here and define equity. So when you think about most corporate environments are still stuck in this diversity and inclusion terminology. So diversity is a measure of the people in the room. So as a group, not as individuals, because individuals aren't diverse. I'm not diverse. I'm a woman. I have a Native American heritage. I look white. From most perspectives, I'm white. I have some disabilities. They're hidden. People can't see them. Doesn't matter. When I'm in the room, I don't sprinkle magical diversity dust in the room and make it a diverse room. What diversity is when you look at a group of people. So first of all, this is a cultural definition. So somebody decides what the group is. Is it the immediate team under a manager? Is it the people under a director or a VP? So somebody is putting all of these expectations around it, and just like a measure in a KPI or something data related, a dashboard. So you define a group, and then you say, what dimensions of diversity are we going to look at? And when you focus on that and you say, I'm going to get a woman in the room, or I'm going to get a Black person in the room, or bonus, I'm going to get just one person who is diverse. And remember, individual people aren't diverse. You have a Black woman who entered the room and you check off 2 boxes. Somebody had to decide, is one person enough? Or is it 50% women, 50% men? And now you've left out all non-binary people. What is the measure of diversity? So that's where the diversity part comes in. Diversity to me is the outcome when you've done the other things right. Companies tend to approach it as, let's start with diversity. So the other things, there's inclusion. So inclusion and belonging are closely tied together. And there's multiple definitions of inclusion. The one I'm going to use here is inclusion is when you create an environment where people can truly be safe and valued when they're authentic. So I can come to work and I can say, I'm sorry. I can downplay my words and do the vocal fry at the end of my voice and make every sentence sound like a question, because that's what I've been rewarded for my entire life. And I've been punished my entire life when I don't do that. So mentoring and coaching of women in tech tends to say, stop saying I'm sorry. Stop having vocal fry in your voice. Stop ending every sentence as if it's a question. Society tells me otherwise. So a truly safe, inclusive, and authentic environment where people can belong would still value people, even when we show up in a way that doesn't fit the white male bar of never say sorry, the white male bar of having even tone and an emotionless voice and an emotionless face and never cry at work. If I can show up and I can cry at work, good chance it's an environment where it's safe to be authentic. I'm not saying that you want to make people cry at work, But if it's comfortable when people do, then that's a pretty safe environment, or it's one metric that the environment might be a safe one. So that's inclusion. Equality is this idea that we learned was a good thing for a really long time. We think about our laws in terms of equality, and equality is treat everyone the same. But that doesn't work. Because again, if you say, well, I want somebody who never says I'm sorry, that's equal. I'm treating the men who never say I'm sorry and the women who never say I'm sorry the same, but that's not equitable because it's making the women change. It's making the people who've been socialized to say I'm sorry all the time change. So equity is saying I'm going to put the effort in, and even if it means that I create all of these training opportunities or sponsorship opportunities, or I hire people that don't meet my traditional criteria. That's equity. Even when I do that, I might be spending more money, more time, more resources on one group than another. As long as I'm spending that on people who have traditionally been oppressed, or who in that environment have been oppressed or marginalized or made to feel less than, that's equitable, even though it's not in the realm of equality. Because equality would say, have the employee resource group for men and the employee resource group for women. It would say have a group for white employees and a group for Black employees. But the truth is, white employees already have a group. It's the whole company. And Black people have a specific gap because the environment, the culture that has been created is that they're not acceptable. And they need to have that community and that group for two reasons. One, because it helps them come together, feel reassured with each other and see role models and all of those internal things. And also because building community inherently disrupts both white supremacy and patriarchy. Because white supremacy and patriarchy are built on purity structures, purity cultures. So they're built on the idea that individuals have all the control in the world and that you shouldn't worry about the people around you. They're built on the idea that there's a strict hierarchy and the only way to move is directly up, that there's no up and down, there's no back and forth. And so every time you build communities, you are inherently breaking those things down.
So there are two questions.
Okay.
First one is, what are your thoughts about remote working, remote first hiring, and D&I? Does this create more equity or does this make the gap wider? Are there tips for employers to support DEI in remote/hybrid work to avoid underrepresented employees from being missed from the building/deepening expertise and career advancement?
Right. So I have a whole page on my website devoted to that. And there's a recording of a talk I did last summer. So go to befriendingdragons.com and go to the schedule page, I think, because it'll show the recording I did last year. So I spent a whole hour on that, and I can't obviously do that today. I would say that it's still up in the air on whether remote work will create more or less diversity. And again, diversity is it's a measure or an outcome. And there are ways that being able to work remotely increases who can be hired, who will be hired, how we treat people who have disabilities, in particular, somebody who may have a need that makes it harder for them to work in an office than from home, such as an autoimmune disease or something that makes them more susceptible to airborne illnesses at work, for example. So you may be hiring more of those sorts of people, but we also have to keep in mind that people with lower incomes tend not to have room to work at home, or they may not have the bandwidth to have their kids online for school and the bandwidth for two spouses to both work. So they may be in smaller homes where there's no room for them to work. And if companies take the cost savings they get from having remote workers and pay it out to their shareholders, then you're not benefiting remote employees. If instead they say, okay, you can be remote and we're going to make sure that we're paying you enough that you can have a home that has an extra room or an extra 2 rooms so that 2 spouses could work. then that might create more equity. It might create outcomes that are better for a wider range of people. So it's a little bit up in the air on remote work, but there are all sorts of biases, including having the camera on. So having the camera on helps people who need to read lips, and that can be not just people with hearing impairments, but a lot of people with autism, for example, need to see your face and your facial expressions and the movement of your mouth in order to fully take in the cues that you're giving, because they have a lot of different ways of interacting with the world that rely on these cues that they have to spend more time interpreting. So there's all sorts of pros and cons to remote work, especially when we're talking about being on remote meetings or Zoom calls or whatever technology we're using. So I know that was a short answer to the question, but go to my website and check that out. Was there another question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was accidental. The person didn't have a question. She just pressed the.
Okay. All right. Well, let me go through these real quick. This is the last slide I have. So let me get through this, and then I'll take questions once I've gone through the points. So having a focus on equity is really important for company survival right now, especially in tech, because we are expanding where we're selling tech across the globe. And the more we get into different cultures, the more aware we have to be, and the more we have to be looking at things from multiple cultural perspectives in order to be able to compete in the tech marketplace. And one thing you can do to have that equity focus is envision places where people feel safe to be authentic, and then make those places happen. We already talked about retention being more important than the hiring, because you can hire all the people in the world you want. When I was at Microsoft, what we were doing was we'd gotten to the point where we were hiring an equal number of men and women. But if you looked at people who'd been at Microsoft for 3 years or more, it was still predominantly men, because the women were turning around and leaving because they weren't valued. They weren't rewarded. They weren't treated in the way they needed to be treated. They were asked to assimilate into the environment as it existed. And that's related to really seeing the people around you and making sure that you're paying attention to what their needs are and not asking them to assimilate. One thing that I worked on when I was at Microsoft in my spare time, for which I was, of course, punished, because when you do diversity and equity work at work, it brings attention to the fact that you're different. It brings attention to the fact that you're spending some amount of time on something other than tech work, and it feeds into the "you're not technical" stereotype that already is prevalent for women. But one of the things we worked on was what we called the power of three. And it's based on the idea that there are a large number of studies that started out looking at boards of corporations. And it was when 3 women got on the boards that the composition and decision-making of the board started to change. And the reason is that that's when it went from being the women on the board were asked to assimilate into the current board. And now there's 3 women. So one woman is like, well, she's being different. She's over here. She's just talking. Whatever, we don't have to listen to her. 2 was like, well, they're banding together. They're just doing that to be different. But it was really when there were 3 of the other, 3 people who were different than the majority. And most of the studies I've seen were based on men and women with no indication of what race that they were. It's when you have 3 of the other in the room that the assimilation starts to go the other way. And the decision-making of the team starts to incorporate the norms of the other, in this case of women. So that's where you change the way you handle interruptions. It's where you change the way you handle hiring and promotions, where you start to create meaningful change is when you start having 3. And it's not just that they're in the room, they have true power in the room. They have a voice, their voice is valued, and their voice is listened to and acted on, and they get to make decisions. So that's the power of 3. Going beyond food, festivals, and famous people are the 3 Fs. So much of what we do at work in diversity is, well, let's celebrate Women's History Month by having a party and serving everybody nachos. whatever it might be. So that's food and festivals. And then you usually invite a woman who, despite all the odds, has been successful. And she describes her path forward, which sounds all rosy. And then we all look at her and go, well, I can't do that because I didn't have a sponsor, or I didn't have a mom who was also in tech way back before, or in that when women stopped being the majority of computer programmers, and then for several decades it was mostly men. Most of us don't have a mom who was in tech in that era. So there are all sorts of things that the people who are successful tell us to do that we just can't replicate, we can't do. So that's going beyond that and creating access for people. So don't just say, hey, I value this, or hey, I'm gonna have a party, but actually create access. Bring in people who are not like you and are not like the people already in power. Bring them in for networking events. Bring them in as speakers. Pay them. Don't ask, like I was asked, to do the diversity work as a side job. Pay somebody. As a woman, that in and of itself did not qualify me to do diversity work. It's the amount of effort I've put into learning how systems work, how oppression works, how inequity works in the world, combined with my life experiences as a woman, that have made me valuable. And we've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to zip through the rest. Do some sort of cultural review. Ask how your product will impact various populations. And you need to ask the people affected, how will this product play out for people who live in rural areas on reservations where there's both a native sovereignty and a US sovereignty at play in the laws, for example. And go ask the people that understand and have lived through that experience. There's the idea of designing for one. What happens if I design this? How does it work for somebody who only has the use of one hand and is on really slow internet and who isn't able to get out of their house on a regular basis, for example? So design for one. Ask that question for a whole bunch of ones. Look at your data collection. Are you collecting data on ability, race, gender? And then what are you doing with it? And when you collect that, how inclusive are you being? For example, pronouns is much more useful than gender in how you market products or how you think about designing products that may appeal more to one gender than another. And then very important, look for the biases in your data and the algorithms built on that data. And I mentioned those books earlier that you can look at, and then take action. So that's all I had prepared. I would be more than happy to talk to you in more depth. You can go to befriendingdragons.com/contact and set up a 30-minute meeting with me. I'm happy to talk to you. There's also, subscribe to my newsletter. So I will be sending out more tips, like the kinds of things that I've talked about here. If you want to hear more, just reach on out. And what other questions do you have in the next 2 minutes?
Anyone have any questions for Cindy? Nope. Nothing here.
Okay. Well, that means I explained everything and everybody knows exactly what to do, right?
It was awesome. It definitely was.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I do want to say that one thing I really emphasize is there's no checklist. There's no, I've done these things and therefore I've reached the end. This is a never ending journey. You decide to step on a journey that's anti-oppression, and it will last the rest of your life. And you will just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's about creating that motivation in yourself to keep doing that. And that's where the real anti-racism, anti-sexism work comes in. So don't think that you have the ability to just go down a checklist and then just put it on a shelf and go away. You have to commit to it and you have to keep doing it. And it is incredibly rewarding. It's also really hard. I put my foot in my mouth all the time, and I've been leaning into this for years. So don't get discouraged. Keep plugging forward and just keep going, keep acting, and keep learning to do and be better. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Mala, for moderating.
It was a pleasure. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.